So welcome to this free monthly group coaching call. I'm Susan Campbell, and I want to remind us that these are going to be public on YouTube, these recordings. And if you miss one of these that you want to catch up on, if you subscribe to my YouTube channel, which I always write that in my newsletter, but here it is. It's Dr. Susan 95472. If you subscribe to me, then I think YouTube sends out notices. And I only put like one up a month. It's not like you're going to get a lot of notices. So our topic today is the inner critic, and kind of the good news and the bad news about the inner critic. So I want to start with a little bit of a lecture, but also discuss with you your experiences. So most of us have some idea of what we mean by the inner critic. And I hope by the end of this hour, you'll have a much fuller picture of what this is. But I'll start with the kind of standard view of the inner critic is that it's a introject that we sort of take in. It's like a conditioned thinking pattern that we take in from early learning through our relationships with our parents, with our peers, with authority, with the rules of society, and so forth. So that's the standard definition. But there's a lot more to it than that. One thing I want to say at the outset, because some of you know my work, is when the inner critic is harsh and very active in the moment, that's some kind of a trigger reaction. And we'll get into that a little bit later. And it's also, some people have sort of a chronic inner critic. It's just like always, oh, you shouldn't have done this. You did that wrong. Why'd you do that? That can be what I call a control pattern. And some of you who've read Getting Real know that I make a big deal out of communication and thought patterns that are relational, that are just in the moment. Here's what I'm feeling, that don't have an evaluation component. It just focus on what is, what I see, and then what I feel. But controlling is not just controlling communication. There's also these personality habits that we call control patterns. And I believe that constant inner critic, if it's that kind of a thing, that's almost like part of your personality, that's actually an attempt to control pain. It's a control pattern in the sense that painful outcomes, painful events are not so controllable. Shit happens. But those of us who've had a lot of wounding around the not good enough theme, let's just say, or not lovable or being rejected, around that theme in our early years, we'll be more susceptible to it being kind of painful when shit happens. So we develop a personality that says, oh, it must be my fault, or there must be something I could have done. So in the childhood, it could be something I could have done to prevent my parents from fighting. You weren't even on the receiving end of criticism, but there was something painful going on. And I don't know exactly why, although I'll give you some thoughts on that in a minute. I don't know exactly why some people's control pattern becomes an inner critic and some other people's control pattern becomes compulsive house cleaning. Those are all managing anxiety, managing pain. So just if any of this has touched you personally right now and you have any comments or questions, first just feel how this is landing for you. And if you want to, just like raise your hand briefly, just so we'll know that you're about to speak, and then speak whatever's there for you, if anything. I just like to leave a little space every now and then. So to continue, it's believed, and I believe, that the painful, uncontrollable realities of life, if they hit us real hard, they're going to affect us more if we haven't had ideal bonding experiences in the first year or so of our life. And some of us don't even know what happened there. But let me just review what leads to a secure parent-child, and usually it's the mother at this point in your life. What leads to a secure bond are things like loving touch, eye contact, soothing voice tones, and then a little bit later, being listened to. And of course, a calm environment, not a lot of yelling and chaos. Okay, so that leads to that inner, it's almost like a wiring in the brain. And I cover all this in the book, 5-Minute Relationship Repair, how the brain gets wired early on. And of course, during gestation, before you're born, your brain wiring is happening. And if chaos and loudness and violence happens, then that also affects this wiring between the cerebral cortex and the amygdala area. And that wiring, a lot of people are saying this now, you can rewire your brain, and you really can, even in adult relationships. So this is just a side track I want to give you, because it's so interesting and useful. You can rewire your brain through relationships in your adult life that are consistently co-regulation, which means touch, eye contact, soothing voice tones, being listened to. These same conditions that lead to a strong bond, a secure attachment in the first year of life, and then, of course, that lasts your whole life. That's like the gift that keeps on giving, you know. But if you don't have that gift, then you can actually make it up later on, even in your adult relationships, if you both are aiming to do this consciously. It usually requires some intention. So that was a sidetrack. So that's kind of like the good news. So I want to ask a few questions now, just to see who's relating to this. So I will want you to just, briefly throw your hand up if you're willing to answer some of these questions. So how many of us have a pretty harsh inner critic that we hear from multiple times a day? Thank you. And everybody just honor that, the people who raise their hands, and how you feel either raising your hand or witnessing this. Because witnessing involves that feeling of connection to the other people. So just want to bring that in. Okay, how many people maybe hear from a fairly harsh inner critic, maybe once a day, maybe a little less, but something around once a day? Okay. Thank you. And then how many daily? It's like, oh, excuse me, less than daily is what I meant to say. How many less than daily? Maybe once a week, once a month, something like that.
Susan, can I have a caveat?
Yes.
When I'm in a good place, right? I hear the inner critic very little, and it could be months. But when I'm in a bad place, right, it could be a day, a week, a month, months. So I feel it ebbs and flows.
Thank you. How many people, that's Heidi, how many people would say that kind of thing? Would that be true for you? I think that was very helpful, Heidi. Yeah. Great.
And Susan, I have another question about when you say inner critic, do you mean inner critic of only ourselves or of ourselves and others?
Of yourself.
Okay, thank you.
Although that's an interesting sidetrack too. We might go there later. That's another control pattern, I would say. Some of us are real good at criticizing others, but we don't turn it on ourselves and vice versa. And hopefully you know who you are. And some of us do both, I guess, based on Karen's question.
Or
Huh?
Susan,
Yeah,
Susan, I have a question. Or could it be when criticizing others, it's a reflection of my inner world as well? Like
sometimes.
I sometimes, okay.
Usually, I mean, if I'm criticizing somebody else, what I call that is that's a limitation in my capacity to love what is. So if I criticize somebody for talking too much in a meeting, you know, I have trouble loving that. And it's often due to like my inability to break into a meeting, my inability to get attention and that sort of thing. It's often, I have this book called Beyond the Power Struggle, and the basic idea of that book, which, you know, is out of print and nobody knows about that book, but the basic idea is the outer struggle mirrors the inner struggle. So if I'm too unassertive, I'm going to be critical of assertive people, but the inner struggle is the struggle between the part of me that wants to speak up in the meeting and the part of me that's afraid. So I project my inner struggle onto many of my relationships in the world. I just walk around like, okay, this is my inner issue, and my projections on others come from that. So that's kind of basically what you just said, Natalie. Okay. How many people have a useful inner critic, or maybe even a compassionate inner critic? If you even know what I mean by that, just we'll get into that because that's the theme of today. But how many people think you already have some usefulness in there? Look at that. I see the back and forth too. And what type of behavior? So I'm curious, to one of you who raised your hands, or any of you, what type of behavior might or incident might trigger the useful inner critic? Do you have anything to say about that? I'll give some examples later from people I know. Okay. Karen, what would be a situation where the useful inner critic would come up?
Where I let myself get triggered and I do a behavior that I feel bad about. And I want to do better.
Uh-huh.
So even though I can be harsh, there's still a behavior that triggered the response of the critic, and I do want to do better in the future.
So that useful part is kind of an intention for the future and a kind of little bit of a learning experience is what I'm getting. Yeah, you learn.
And acknowledging a behavior that I didn't feel good about in my heart of hearts.
Yeah. And Natalie, you want to share something?
For me, my compassionate inner self comes up when I really create the space in me to really feel what's being touched and what is reacting, and seeing that it's a part of me that is younger. And then this is where, when I get to that place, I can connect as well to a compassionate, caring, kind.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for that. And of course, that's one of the places that I'm getting to today. That's kind of one of the cornerstones of what I'm teaching, especially in the book From Triggered to Tranquil, where every trigger reaction, and maybe there's some initial embarrassment. Oh, I got triggered, or, oh, I wish I didn't get triggered, something like that. But as you touch into the feeling associated with the trigger, the pain, oh gee, I felt left out, I felt rejected. I mean, those aren't really feelings, but they're associated with emotional incidents, often from a childhood place, needs that did not get met. So I will maybe even work with a volunteer on this a little bit later, but thank you, Natalie. And I think Don had your hand up at one point. You had something to share about a useful or compassionate.
Oh yeah, it's wonderful that, of course, I've been working with you for many years. You've been my friend and mentor for many years, and so I have learned trigger work. Why I call it trigger work. It's kind of like trigger work on steroids. When the over time, it seems like when things get triggered, like well, to bring it into the example you're talking about is inner critic. Um, there was a time in my life where I would lose something, and then I would get very upset, and I would just start with this rant that I would actually out loud, and like, but over time, as Natalie talked about, um, as I learned more self-compassion, I learned how to, oh, I'm triggered. This is what's going on. Breathe, push pause, take a break. And what I find is that that is really, it's diminished quite a bit, but it's not completely gone. Because the other day I was looking for something that I thought I had, and it came up again. And I thought, oh, but it came up. I mean, I could feel the upset, but I could also feel myself laughing.
Mhm.
And here I go again. And to know that I didn't have to follow it all the way through. And that's the beauty of doing this kind of work that we do.
Yeah. And when we're first learning trigger work, it's important to follow it all the way through to a little bit of pain, at least. You don't want to maybe go into a trauma reaction out of it, but you do something that you criticize in yourself, or maybe just somebody does something like walks out while you're talking, and you weren't your own stimulus. See, we can trigger ourselves with our self-critique, but most of the time it's some kind of shit happens, in the outside world that we weren't prepared for, that brings back some feeling of an early need that wasn't met, need for loving attention, being trusted to do a little bit of trial and error on your own as a kid rather than being over controlled, being given guidance, being shown how to do things. These are sort of the basic childhood needs, and of course loving attention is the main one. And so if any of those needs are not met, then our personalities develop fear of abandonment, fear of being controlled, fear of being overwhelmed, fear of my needs don't matter, that sort of thing. So we'll go around scanning for whatever it is the need was that wasn't met back there. We get triggered, and it's an opportunity. So this is what I think Don is really saying here. Trigger work is, feeling this reactivity in myself and knowing that there's more to it than just my superficial reaction. Staying with it, saying, I need a pause. Let me calm myself, called self-regulation. Calming with breathing, conscious breathing, feeling your feet on the floor, your butt on the chair, feeling that environment kind of holding you, all the things that different people have different things. Dancing, listening to music, doing something physical can also be a self-regulation. But then you get good at it, and you can kind of have a smile like Don had. Or for me, I get good at it, and it takes me less than a second to just do a little bit of this. Honey is the way I think of it. Honey. And then I mean, I register that. It isn't that quick, but just register that. And it's almost like I did a whole 7 minutes of trigger work. The whole trigger work sequence where you start with what you're feeling on top and you just follow your feelings, follow your body sensations, see if any memories come up. This is what trigger work is. So when people can use that inner critic as, oh, that's a trigger reaction, let me pay attention to what it feels like, what it's saying to me, what that reactive part of me needs, just kind of listening to yourself. And meditation will do that for people. I actually discovered trigger work myself through meditation, through starting with some painful thing that happened, and you just sit with it. And so there's something natural. There's a natural ability for us to heal ourselves if we just kind of slow down and think, and not think we know everything, So I want to give you an example of a guy that I know who had a work situation that triggered him, just to see if any of you guys can relate to this. This is an example of I'm going to say the good father archetype. I'm talking, when I talk about trigger work, it's usually got that compassion flavor to it. I just make up that the father inside of us is more of a coach, more of an inner coach. It actually can kind of give you good advice sometimes if you can get under the critical part. So really the useful pieces of your inner critic are kind of the good father archetype and the good mother archetype. So I'm going to give you some examples of the good father. That Bob, he's at work and he's in a kind of sales. I don't even know what his actual job is, but he's some kind of sales where he has accounts and he has to service these accounts to these clients for a big company. So the triggering situation is one of his clients doesn't give him feedback that they're not trusting him. They go to his boss. So his boss comes and tells Bob that this client doesn't trust you for whatever reasons. And this, of course, is very hurtful to Bob to hear, gee, the client should have come, first reaction is the client should have come to me. I even asked the client for feedback. Why didn't they tell me? So there's, that feeling inside. And so I asked, he was a client. So I asked Bob to, he's just telling me about what his inner critic is saying at first, just the top of his awareness. And I hear the words, he says, "You brought it on yourself." So I let him finish, and then I asked him to flesh out, when you say you brought it on yourself, and maybe some of you have said this to yourself, there might be more information in there. So I said, tell Bob, be the voice of this critic. I had a feeling there was something useful in there. Tell Bob how he brought it on himself. So it didn't take him long. He had quite a bit of self-awareness. He said, well, I did ask for feedback several months ago, but it was just in a generic way. I never followed up to really sit down with him and say, I need to hear if what I'm offering is meeting your needs. He didn't actually make a time for the feedback. So that was one of his, I would say, useful critiques of himself. Because if you want feedback in a business setting, or even with your kids or friends, you don't just say, come tell me if I ever do anything that bothers you. You have to actually say, how's my parenting style working for you, 15-year-old son? You have to make a time and make yourself believable that you're really ready to hear it. So, because people don't come, don't usually just come and offer feedback unsolicited. You think you've solicited it, but you didn't. You didn't really stand behind that request. So that was one of his critiques. I had him feel into that, and he could handle that just fine. That's pretty good learning. And then he also realized that the latest meeting was a little bit contentious, and he was tired and hungry, and he kind of rushed through that meeting. And that would have been a great opportunity too, if he wouldn't have been so rushed, to ask the client for feedback, because it was that meeting that triggered the client going over his head to his boss. So he didn't actually ask for feedback again when it would have been a good time. And let me see, what else did I have to say? That was actually it. So he realized that he has a hard time hearing bad news. How many of us here have a hard time hearing bad news? Like if it's in a work situation or from a friend? No, it was an important awareness for him to realize. And as we talked further about his difficulty hearing bad news, then we got into, so we sort of covered the good father archetype, gave him some kind of good advice that he's going to pay attention to in the future. But when we got to gee, I'm not good at hearing feedback or even asking for feedback of any sort, because I'm afraid it's going to be bad news. So notice if that's true for you. And what we got into was when he was about age 8, 9, 10, he heard a lot of bad news, at least from his point of view. For his nervous system, a lot of kids didn't seem to like him. He didn't get picked for the team. With his parents, he just ran into a number of situations where he didn't handle things well, and his parents criticized him. It wasn't like you wouldn't think of this as a super traumatic childhood, but there was this period of his life that has a lot to do with socialization and your self-perception regarding peer relationships and authority relationships, where he became kind of phobic about feedback. And when we kind of went back into that memory, he developed quite a instinctive compassion for that little 9-year-old kid, who was a good kid. He wasn't that bad in sports. He wasn't that bad in anything, but he was a little bit sensitive. Maybe he always had a very sensitive nervous system. He couldn't really register any difficulty with parent-child bonding. It didn't go back that far as he could discover. It was just this socialization period where he felt kind of like not good enough, not accepted. And so he was able to give compassion to that 9-year-old kid and realize that, yeah, there's a tenderness there around hearing bad news, and that's okay. That's what we want to get to, and that's the good mother archetype. Whatever you are is okay by me. You're lovable just as you are. And everything that you do, even like bad behavior, is understandable. If we just look a little deeper and here, I'll be with you while you feel into what you're able to become aware of. So what he came out of with the session was, of course, more compassion for his 9-year-old, but also an intention to practice hearing bad news in little ways, like, from his wife and kids first, before trying it at work, because it's his work performance where he really would get triggered. He felt pretty safe at home. So just want to give you that example of one person who had like one incident that triggered the inner critic. And I'm going to ask for a volunteer to talk with me about perhaps a specific situation in your life in a minute or two or a few minutes. But first, I want to get any comments, questions, any thoughts you have at this point about this topic or what happened to Bob, or do you relate to Bob's story?
I do somehow, in an unexpected way. When you talked about the socialization time of a child, something resonated, like it's like landed in me really strongly. And I could remember a time when I wasn't feeling part of the group. I was always feeling rejected and like on the offside and alone. And I was wondering what this was about. Where was this coming from? And I think it has to do with that time. I'm not sure exactly why. It's probably, I don't know exactly. I don't have like a specific moment to anchor it. But there's something about the socialization time as a child that it didn't go like really smoothly, I think.
Well, I'm thinking, so thank you, Natalie, that I'm wanting to encourage you then to be curious about this. It sounds like you're getting curious now just from hearing this idea of there's this period, this socialization period. I think of it in terms of the early school years. It's like when you first start school. That's a whole new world, you know. And so there's certain kinds of wounding that happens there. So then later in life, you somehow, gee, I don't like these kind of parties or whatever it is, you know. I don't want to join a sports team, just something. So I get, Natalie, that you don't have a specific like current incident right now, but I hope you'll come up with one soon. I don't want to wish pain upon you, but if something comes up, that would be a great opportunity for you to just feel what that feels like here and now, you know, in your adult body and your, you know, adult feelings, and see where it leads you. Very often when you just take the time to be with yourself like that, and that's the good mother, taking the time to be with yourself. When you do that, parts of yourself that haven't been listened to will just bubble up from the subconscious. And so, you know, I encourage everybody to do that. And Natalie, if you did have a specific current situation, I might ask you to be a volunteer, but I'll just keep surveying around. Anything else come up, either hearing what Natalie said or I just said, or about Bob? Even something simple, you know, doesn't have to be significant for you to speak. Karen.
Yeah, I realize that I have a lot of fear around feedback because I thought that I was damaged goods because of how I was treated as a child. And so the feedback really just, the negative feedback was really affirming that to me.
Yeah,
And I could see how it played out in my life, in my jobs, and when there would be some kind of negative feedback or in a personal relationship, even a lot of fear.
sure. And you know, in my workshops, which a number of you have been in now, I I emphasize a lot staying on your own side of the net when you give feedback, which means you're talking about the impact on me that specific behavior had, you know, without an interpretation. That's the giving of the feedback, so that at least you're doing what you can to speak in a way that helps the other feel safe. But even so, receiving the feedback is usually the harder part. And being able to hear, I mean, just being able to hear feedback is such an important life skill. And so many people need just drills and drills, you know. So in my workshops, there's a lot of giving and receiving feedback because so many people need it. Like what you said, Karen, it's hard. And I trained at this organization when I was first training to be a facilitator. I trained at this organization called NTL Institute. It was first called National Training Labs. It's where T groups originated. And one of the main things in these T groups was giving and receiving feedback. So I'm in my early 20s. And I'm in these intense groups where I'm getting a lot of feedback. And I had a dream. I got to tell you, my dream was I'm walking along a country road, and all of a sudden this car goes by, and they have this bucket, and they toss this bucket of food on me, and then they just keep driving. Okay, food, feedback, all right. Is this going to feed me or not? So my thought was in the dream, gee, I wonder if this has been eaten or not, already been eaten or not. Now, I made that to mean, is this garbage? You know, is this like somebody's vomit, or is this food, actual nourishment? Because that was, in your subconscious, your dreams sometimes carry, work on what you're working on. And everybody, had that fear that feedback was garbage because it was other people's projections. So there's that problem too. I'll let you work that one out yourself. But feedback is probably hard for most people. And let me ask this question of everybody. How many of you, as part of your life, either, as a parent or a group facilitator or a friend, how many people actually seek feedback as part of your daily, not daily maybe, but your life? Anybody? Don, you guys do? Nancy? Yeah. Anybody want to say anything? Because I actually don't ask for feedback as much as I preached to ask for feedback. In other words, I don't always practice what I preach here. I'm aware of that as I'm asking this question. So somebody who does ask for feedback, let's
Yes.
hear
Yeah,
from somebody I can use as a role model.
yes.
Yeah, Don, what can you teach us?
Well, particularly, I have lived with housemates for most of my adult life, and I find that if I don't ask for feedback, and this is I learned this because I had this pattern earlier on of like I wouldn't say anything to housemates, and they do things that would piss me off, and I wouldn't say anything, and then eventually over time I would blow up, and then I'd say something nasty, and it took me. This was a long time ago, but so what I've learned is that particularly in living with housemates, is being able to clear the air as much as possible. I have a friend of mine, Paul, who's when I lived up in Lake County, he used to say, he had this metaphor of acorns to oaks. He says, if you don't talk about the little acorns of annoyances and things, they can grow into mighty oaks.
Good, yeah.
And so it just makes sense to be able to clear the air and do that. But outside of that, like in public or whatever, I do not solicit feedback.
Yeah.
Because typically feedback ends up being more like your dream, where it's some sort of an emotional vomiting, and it's like venting or whatever. And to vent without consent is to make a dent.
Yeah. Yes.
So
Yeah.
anyway, yeah.
Thanks for that. Thanks for mentioning clearing practice.
Yeah. So, but but like you, and if feedback is not necessary, then I leave it alone.
What do you, I'm not going to ask you to dialogue with me about this, but just a general question. What helps me judge whether feedback is necessary? And I guess I'm guessing now, and you can tell me if this is true, that it has to do with if you feel something incomplete,
Right.
then would it be necessary? And if you feel
That's
complete, not?
yes, that's really tricky business because that would require a certain level of awareness that I don't think I've reached yet. Um, and so it could also be a defense mechanism, but specifically what I'm thinking of is that I have I have a situation with my younger brother who, for a while, he would just vent, and it was really hard to get. And it's I don't want to get into the whole thing, but what I learned over time is how to set boundaries with him, and also, and in setting boundaries, he's learning when it's okay to vent and when it's not. Not because I'm teaching him anything, it's just I'm setting boundaries and he begins to understand that that's a form of feedback that
Hmm.
he's beginning to pick up. It's not necessarily where I'm going to give you some feedback. It's just like I'm setting a boundary. You know, right now, this is going on for me. I don't have the time. I don't have the bandwidth to really listen to you right now. But, you know, maybe tomorrow and we can continue this. Then that works. So, so my thing is about this thing about venting. It seems like it's a necessary thing, and it, it's there can be healthy venting where sometimes friends have conversations and you complain about the weather or about politics or whatever, and but when it becomes more of an obsessive thing, where and this is the thing I was getting with my brother is like he didn't seem to have awareness to know his effect on me and the effect on the other people in his life, and he's learning now, so that's good. So I'm able to somehow work with that with him. That's specific sort of situation for me.
I want to draw another lesson from your story about your brother, and the generalization that I'm making up hearing Don's story is if you know how to set boundaries and you have confidence in, oh, nope, that's enough for me right now, that type of thing, you will probably be less afraid of unsolicited feedback coming at you.
Yes.
So that's what I make up, and that's a nice little lesson I'm gonna hold.
Yes. Yes.
Anybody else want to make a comment about your own what you related from what has been shared? Nancy.
Hey, Susan. Your question to Dawn was about soliciting feedback, and what came to mind for me is that I have 3 really close friends that I feel comfortable asking feedback, but that's it.
Well,
Kind
it's
of like Dawn. I'm not going out in the general. Yeah.
your internet cuts in and out, Nancy, but it's really good to have a close circle where you're like in the Getting Real work, I call it, they're practice partners for each other, and where we agree that we will clear the air if something's coming up that is unfinished or unsettling between us, that we will initiate feedback. So you have that with your 3 close friends, right, Nancy?
Yeah, or if there's something going on in my life in a relationship and I will say, I see it this way. Will you give me feedback about whether you see it differently?
That's a great question to ask people. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now what we're coming to is just out of what Don and Nancy said is having, if you want to learn how to hear and deliver bad news in a healthy way, it's good to have some kind of clearing practice that you do with 1 or 2 or more other people in your life by agreement. you either have regular clearing sessions. If you're a couple, for example, then you can save a lot of money on marriage counseling if people would only do this. Or with if you're the boss and you've got some employees, you have it set up on the calendar. We're going to do this. We're not going to just do it once every year or so. So a clearing practice basically is, tell me what I've done or said since our last clearing practice that has created distance between us, or mistrust, or discomfort in any way. I want to hear it. And then ideally, the structure would be, well, when you specifically did this, I felt this, or my inner reaction could be a thought as well as a feeling, was this. And you have a structure to it. Because sometimes when people are invited to give feedback, then they just lay it on thicker and thicker, and then I go this and da. And then all of a sudden the feedback has no value. So that's a tip about giving feedback, is keep it short. It takes fewer words to speak the truth. Now, anybody want to go a little deeper? Maybe you don't have anything, but it would have to be kind of like Bob. He had a specific recent incident where he didn't ask for feedback. This is not really about feedback, this little webinar. It's more about, it set off his inner critic. So we either find the good inner coach, the father, or we find the good inner mother, the compassionate space holder. We find that when we start with an incident. So that's sort of the inner work when your inner critic is activated. Anybody have a specific that we could use as a demonstration?
Susan, I have an example that I shared with you recently, but my father recently made a request, a very big request of me that I felt I had to say no to. Maybe in a different time, I would have said yes. But having set the boundary and having said no, the inner critic was loud and roaring that I was a selfish daughter, that my dad had done so much for me. And how could you do this by saying no?
So let's start with, you said no to your father, and you have these kind of like triggered feelings here that are like, how could you say no to your father? I want to try something. I don't know if we did this or not. I want to try answering that question. How could you say no to your father? So you've got this inner critic, but you've got the recipient of the critic. So there's lots of ways to work with the inner critic. So this time I want to go, okay, I just heard a thing that could actually be, it's harsh, but it could actually be a request for information. So, Heidi, what are your reasons for saying no to your father at this time? From that place, let us hear from you.
Sure. And just to let everyone know, it was to borrow a large sum of money.
So you have already, I'm thinking she's got some good reasons here. But so I'm going to say, be the part of yourself that stands up for yourself in this case.
Well, for number one, I have a husband, so it's not only my decision. Number two, if I get entangled, it's just going to be a giant mess. It's going to entangle me and my family.
And there may be some things you don't want to say right now, is what
Sure.
I'm imagining about your family situation. So I'm gonna go with that because out of respect for, your
Sure.
family privacy.
Sure.
But as you speak what you just spoke in terms of your good reasons, just how did that feel?
It felt very rational and I could hear it in my head and it makes perfect sense. But it still doesn't feel good.
So now let's go back to the yes, but I'm not being a loyal daughter after all a parent does for a child and so forth. So feel into how it feels to receive your own criticism there. Just feel the feeling. Notice if there's any body sensations. See what's there and share anything you can.
It feels pretty sad, really sad.
Mhm. Where do you notice that sadness in your body?
Like tension in the heart.
And I noticed your hands there. Is there any impulse to put a hand on the heart there like that?
Sure.
Just try that and just feel into that heart, that tension. Just let that be, breathe and make space. What we want to do with emotional pain is consciously breathe in a way that gives us the sense that there's I'm using this gesture here, that there's more space inside of me for whatever wants to be felt. So I'm just taking that attitude and slowing and deepening my breath. And just notice what happens next. Sometimes the pain will move. Sometimes you'll have memories or thoughts or self-talk.
Yeah, the pain is still there but memories come up, right?
What's a memory that's coming to you now?
It's just that, that it's not one that I personally identify. Well, that the thought that comes is my dad was a struggling immigrant and he worked so hard for our family and for me, and he gave me everything, and you can't give this to him now.
Mm-hmm. So it's in
Guilt, yeah.
So it's more kind of like evidence that you're a bad daughter in
Yes, is coming.
So yeah, let yourself feel the impact of that voice, and that critical voice. Gee, he was a struggling immigrant, and look at what the opportunities were he gave you.
I think what comes up is for both my parents is I never felt like I was enough, or I could never do enough to be.
Yeah. And part of that is connected to how hard they struggled. The story that they struggled so hard. And there's also a complementary story that goes along with that, was if they struggled and sacrificed, then I've got to earn that some way. Feel into what age maybe did you take this on, to begin to take this on? I'm just kind of moving this rather quickly now.
Sure. Probably early tweens, maybe 10.
So see if we can get an image of 10-year-old Heidi, in that family. And we're witnessing her now. And we're witnessing that she took on this kind of, I'll call it this burden, this responsibility to earn goodness. And just feel and witness. Like, you're feeling a little bit about what it was like for 10-year-old Heidi, but you're also witnessing it as your adult self. And see how much of that you can do here. And is there anything you feel toward 10-year-old Heidi in this moment?
I feel a lot of compassion that she had to take on the burden of kind of taking care of her family.
Yeah. So let's land there, and all of us who are witnessing, let's land there in how we can feel compassion also for that 10-year-old who had to take on that burden, or somehow took on that burden. Yeah, and we can just let her be held, let her be felt. You're okay. I get you, that type of feeling. You're part of me. So we can kind of bring some closure with a few slow, conscious breaths. Yeah, I for myself, I always want to do this. It's just my way of anchoring in that compassion feeling, because I can lose it, but this brings it back. We have about a minute left here. Anybody here relate personally to anything that you saw? Yeah, you can just do this, or you can comment, relate personally to what you saw and witnessed here. Thank you. See some hearts too. Another heart, yeah. These, I think these hearts don't show up in the recording. So I'll just, we have lots of hearts here, folks, people who are watching this recording on YouTube. So I think we'll close with that. So the inner critic can be a doorway into the more tender parts of ourselves once we get that idea and practice it. So thanks for dialing in today. And I do these on the first Tuesday of every month, 10 to 11 a.m. Pacific time. If you want to get the Zoom link, subscribe to my newsletter at susancampbell.com. And that's all the advertisement I have for today. I'm just glad.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks for coming and joining me.
Love you, dear human. Love you.
Thank you.
Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi.
Susan?
Yeah.
How long does it usually take for these to get onto YouTube?
Like a day.
Okay, cool.
I usually do it right away. Yeah. Hi, Scott. Nice to see you. Are you lying down?
Yeah, I got super sick, so I slept in and missed this one.